Hi everyone, I'm David Scranton from the Income Generation. And there seems to be a lot of hoopla these days, and no, that's not a technical financial term, but there is a lot of hoopla, if you will, about this whole debt ceiling and what will happen if we go beyond October 18th without raising this ceiling. If we default on our debt, as Janet Yellen said, as a country, it could be devastating for us. And whereas she's correct, it could be, the reality is that that won't happen. Last time we actually had a government shutdown and we shaved expenses elsewhere and we never defaulted on a dime of our debt. So first I want to talk about why it would be so devastating if we did actually have a default. You know, last time when this happened and we threatened it, but never defaulted and spent several weeks with a government shutdown, we saved money through other government expenses so that we were able to continue to pay our debt. But still, one of the major rating agencies went ahead and lowered us for the first time from a AAA rating to a AA rating. And that had very little impact on us. But the reality is an actual default would increase the interest rate that the government would have to charge moving forward to borrow money. So that's true whether they want to borrow more money because, let's say, they want to borrow money for the initiatives in the Biden tax plan, or they just borrow more money because some of the existing bonds come due. Remember, there's a certain amount of borrowing that has to happen by the federal government on a regular basis just because existing bonds mature and they either have to pay them off or they have to roll it over again. And of course, the government has a real axe to grind in keeping the interest rates low, because if they let interest rates go up, interest rates could end up swallowing all of the government's tax revenues and there'd be nothing left for anything else. So clearly a default would be devastating because now other investors, other countries, our own investors would say, gosh, we're not going to buy a 10-year government bond and get paid 1.5% interest per year, as is the rate today on a 10-year US government bond. They might say if there's more risk because there's been a default, even temporary, we might require 3%, or like some other countries, maybe 5 or 6. And of course, you double or triple the cost to carry of that debt. And, again, it's devastating. So obviously that's not going to happen. So what is happening right now? Well, it's basically a little bit of a political discussion because between the Democratic administration that's really following through on this thing called MMT, modern monetary theory, which basically says you can just keep printing money, keep borrowing more money, and as long as you're printing your own money, you just print more and it's okay, it doesn't really matter. Versus more conservatives who are saying, wait a minute, at some time, we may have to pay this debt off. We can't just borrow forever without any end in sight. So what's the real answer? Well, the real answer is that there are a lot of Ponzi schemes that go on for a long time before they finally come to an end. Think about Bernie Madoff, right? Bernie Madoff did a great job for a long time, as a criminal that is, by keeping his Ponzi scheme a secret, where whenever other people needed to redeem money, he had new investors coming in, he could pay off the old investors with the new money, the traditional definition of a Ponzi scheme. And that worked great until something really bad happened. What was that bad thing? Well, in this particular case, it was the financial crisis of 2008. And people started to run on Bernie Madoff's hedge fund and say, look, we want our money back, we're worried. And there wasn't enough money there to pay them back. So things can go on for a long time until eventually they don't. And the same is true with this. One thing we've really never experienced before is the level of debt around the world that we have today. We've seen companies default on their debt in the past. We had the Russian ruble crisis occur in the late 1990s. We have countries like Brazil default more than once. And they come back and now they don't owe their debt anymore because they defaulted, and it's like a bankruptcy without actually having to declare bankruptcy. But then now when they want to borrow more money, it's at a higher interest rate, which is fine because they just, they have no debt, so they could pay a little bit more. So there's certain countries that have had that track record, but we've never looked at what would happen if the whole world has this problem. And the issue we're having right now in the world is it's not just the United States. Everybody talks about our debt to GDP ratio being the highest it's been since World War II. Well, that's great, but that can be said of a lot of the Western world. And we always thought China was in such great shape because they're advertising, growth in their economy of 6 to 8% per year. But we've recently learned in a couple different instances that China isn't always as forthcoming as we like with the truth about that. We first saw that when this whole coronavirus, COVID-19, came out in November and December, and the Chinese government was less than forthcoming about the disease, and that allowed it to spread more aggressively throughout the rest of the world. And also recently we've seen some flaws where all those ghost towns in China, the towns in the big cities where these big skyscrapers were built and they sat there empty, and no offices really, no companies really inhabited them, but the government was doing this to support workers, support the building process, support the economy. And now you've got, the biggest builder in China that's threatening to default on its debt. So you have to look and say, okay, if everybody owes money to each other, each country, and frankly, we're one of the cleaner shirts in the world's dirty economic hamper, then what does that all mean? It's no longer a question of just Brazil defaulting and leaving a few other countries high and dry. It's a question of a chain reaction. If one of the major established nations starts to default, how is that going to affect everybody else? Because most of the countries have debt to GDP ratios that rival ours, if not are higher. Well, you have to question what's going to happen, and the reality is it's unprecedented. We've never seen it before. What happens if every country defaults, or if one does and then there's a chain reaction? Well, if every country defaults and basically forgives the debt that's owed to them, then everybody starts with a clean slate, and it's almost as if nothing happened. That's one possible scenario. Okay? But the reality is it's unprecedented. We haven't seen this happen on a universal basis like we have it today. So it's one big laboratory experiment, all this printing of money, all this MMT, modern monetary theory, and we don't know how it's going to end. And sometimes when you have a laboratory experiment, the results end up with a great positive learning. Other times it ends up with an explosion. But the one thing I can assure you of is right now, all the politics that's being played with the Democrats versus the Republicans, and this whole October 18th debt ceiling date, all the politics are there because one party wants to spend money under modern monetary theory and just not worry about ever paying it back. The other party's trying to be a little bit more fiscally conservative, looking at traditional economics, and they at some point have to compromise in the middle. And until then, this debt ceiling can be held out there as a pawn. But again, as we've seen in the past, even if we go past October 18th, it's not going to be devastating. Because unlike Janet Yellen says, the reality is we're not going to default on our debt. We might shut the government down temporarily. We might do other things to try to curb expenses. But we, the great United States of America, is not going to default on its debt. Not now and not ever, if there's anything that we can do as a country humanly possible to pay our bills. So it's great to listen to the media and the news because you get to learn some things, but sometimes you listen to the news and it's just a bunch of scare tactics. And that's why, on one hand, it is good to listen, but on the other hand, sometimes it's better not to pay attention. Life is much more peaceful that way. And this is one of those areas where you might reduce your stress by not paying attention to the headlines. I hope that helps. And if you like this video, go ahead and click thumbs up to tell us you like us. And go ahead and sign up on our YouTube channel as a follower to get more videos, more information about timely financial topics just like this. Thank you.